Today, I wanted to talk about the decision that the judge made in the Quinn Emanuel case out in the Northern District Court in California, because there is something so interesting about this for me, and there is something so curious and something I believe that we all have to learn just from this decision. Now, I don't actually want to talk about the facts of the case themselves or what happened. I will put a link in the description below where you can look at what exactly happened in the case, what the judge said when he sanctioned not only an associate who was the lawyer in the particular case, but also two of the partners for this particular law firm. And the judge ended up assigning a penalty of millions of dollars. And I think that this is significant because they found that the conduct of the particular attorneys was created by the culture of the firm in particular. And not only did they tell Quinn Emanuel that they needed to fix their personal firm culture, but also that they needed to come up with the plan to do it themselves. And I thought that this was a novel way of handling this kind of problem, but it also highlights an issue that many law firms have. How do you create a culture? How do you ensure that people buy into it? How do you hold that line of ethical line, moral line, the company line, the firm line? How do you continue to hold this? How do you teach it to your coming in associates? And how do you make sure that it is maintained in your firm? And one of the things that's been so interesting for me is to also look at how you do this not only when you have one firm, one office where people are physically present, so that this kind of thing can be translated more naturally, because you and I both know that values and this kind of usually non-expressed ethical choice is transmitted without words. Now, this doesn't mean that most firms don't have their values probably printed somewhere beautifully, written down. And this doesn't mean that the individual attorneys themselves don't have values. But when you're talking about what does your firm value, and when you want to not only train people in how to do that, but ensure that they're actually doing it, that is another thing entirely. And I think this is where most firms miss the mark. They say, this is our value. For example, our firm is family friendly, and yet the behavior that they reward time and time again is staying late, missing your kid's game, working overtime, working in the evening, working on holiday, or not taking time off when you have a sick child, because they believe they want to be family friendly, but in a way, they don't actually mean it, or they mean it in some way that is not truly expressed. And so maybe they mean, we want you to have families, but we don't prioritize the time you spend with them. And that's fine if that's what someone chooses as a value, but that is not what most of us would recognize as family friendly. And so in this case, what they say is the value, what may be written down in a document somewhere, is not actually the reality. And not only is it not the reality in the things that partners say to young associates, but it is also not the reality reinforced over time through behavior, through reward mechanisms. And so this is one of those things where when you choose values as your firm, you have to reinforce it verbally and non-verbally and constantly. You have to do it again and again. And you have to reinforce it even when it's hard. And so if your culture is to hold this ethical line, to hold this value, then everyone needs to buy into it and everyone needs to do it. And so it becomes significantly more difficult when you are working with a dispersed workforce. For example, most of us don't work in an office anymore, so we're not seeing each other constantly. And so we don't have those opportunities to connect with the attorneys that are to be teaching us, to be showing us with the regular way that they show up, that these are the firm values. And so also, it is something that it is hard to do when you have different offices, because often each office has its own culture, its own sense of values, its own reinforcement mechanisms. And so this is a place for everyone to consider, how can we do this more? How can we do this better? How can we encourage not only this kind of growth, encourage the values that our firm has decided it truly wants to hold, but how do we do it when we are not physically present in a way that we traditionally have been? How do we continue to have these conversations? How do we continue to talk about and make the difficult decisions so that we can work in alignment with our values? I'm Moira. This is Law Transformed. I'm a former IP attorney turned legal practice consultant. And this kind of question, I think, is so important for us to look into and to consider when we're building our law firms and when we're growing. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy lawyering. Bye-bye.